If you think you know everything about Alcatraz, think again. What you're about to hear will make your blood run cold. Smash that like button, drop a comment if you dare, and subscribe because this story will haunt you long after it ends. June 11th, 1962. The night 3 men vanished from the most secure prison in America. But this isn't just about an escape. This is about what they left behind, what happened in those cells after they were gone, and why federal agents are still asking questions 60 years later. The body was discovered on a Tuesday morning in March 2018. A maintenance worker named David Chen was conducting routine checks in cell block D, the isolation unit they used to call the hole. The section had been closed to tourists for months due to structural repairs. David's flashlight cut through the darkness as he descended the metal stairs, each step echoing against concrete walls that had witnessed decades of human suffering. When he reached cell 14, he stopped. The door was open. That door was supposed to be welded shut in 1995. Inside, slumped against the back wall, was a man in his late 70s. He wore a faded prison uniform from the 1960s, the kind that hadn't been issued in over 50 years. His skin was grey, eyes frozen open, staring at something on the wall that wasn't there anymore. In his right hand, he clutched a rusted spoon, sharpened to a point. Scratched into the wall beside him were 3 words, carved deep into the stone: "They are waiting." David backed out of the cell and called the National Park Service police. Within an hour, FBI Special Agent Rachel Morrison arrived from San Francisco. She had spent 15 years investigating cold cases, but nothing had prepared her for this. The man had no identification, no wallet, no modern clothing. His fingerprints were run through every database in the country. Nothing. It was as if he had materialized from another era. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to David, was the forensic pathologist assigned to the autopsy. What she found made her question everything she knew about her profession. The man's body showed signs of prolonged malnutrition and exposure consistent with someone who had been living in extremely harsh conditions for years. But there was something else, something that didn't make sense. His dental work was from the 1950s. His lungs showed damage consistent with prolonged exposure to the damp, cold air of Alcatraz during its operational years. The decay in his bones suggested he had been drinking the same mineral-heavy water that flowed through the prison's pipes before 1963. Agent Morrison began pulling archived records from the Bureau of Prisons. She cross-referenced every inmate who had served time in cell block D between 1934 and 1963, when Alcatraz closed. There were hundreds of names, but one file stopped her cold. Prisoner 1476 AZ. Thomas Edwin Blackwell. Convicted of murder in 1958. Sentenced to life. Last known location: Cell 14, isolation. Reported missing during the mass transfer of prisoners in March 1963, when Alcatraz officially shut down. Presumed to have been accidentally released or transferred under the wrong name during the chaos of the closure. Never found. Case closed in 1965 due to lack of leads. Morrison pulled up Blackwell's intake photo. Her hands trembled as she held it next to the morgue photograph. The resemblance was undeniable. Same narrow face, same prominent cheekbones, same distinctive scar above the left eyebrow. But this was impossible. If Thomas Blackwell had been released in 1963, he would have been in his early 30s. The man in the morgue was in his late 70s, exactly the age Blackwell would be today if he had somehow remained on Alcatraz for the past 55 years. Morrison returned to the island with a forensic team. They swept cell 14 with luminol, revealing decades-old bloodstains on the floor and walls. They found a loose stone in the corner that concealed a small hollow space. Inside were items that made Morrison's pulse quicken: a journal written in cramped, desperate handwriting, newspaper clippings from the 1962 escape, and 3 photographs of men she immediately recognized. Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin, the famous escapees. She opened the journal to the last entry, dated June 10, 1962. One day before the escape. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible. "They promised to come back for me." Morris said they would return through the maintenance tunnels once they reached the mainland. "But I know the truth now. I know what they found in the basement. I know why the warden closed off the lower levels. They're not coming back because they can't. Nothing that goes down there comes back unchanged. Morrison turned the page. The next entry was dated March 2018, written in the same hand but steadier, colder. I've been waiting in the dark for 56 years. I've survived on rats and rainwater. I've listened to the tourists walking above me, laughing, taking pictures, completely unaware that the prison never really closed. The others are still here, in the flooded tunnels beneath D Block. And they're hungry. But when Morrison ordered her team to search for access to the basement levels, what they found changed everything. The basement entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the shower room adjacent to cell block D. Morrison's team used ground-penetrating radar to locate it, a steel door covered by decades of concrete and paint. When they finally broke through, a wave of cold, fetid air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of decay and salt water. The door opened onto a narrow staircase descending into absolute darkness. Morrison could hear water dripping somewhere far below, and something else, a rhythmic scraping sound, like metal dragging across stone. She assembled a team of 6, 2 FBI agents, 2 structural engineers from the Park Service, a forensic specialist, and a historian named Dr. Marcus Webb who had spent 30 years studying Alcatraz. They descended single file, their flashlights cutting through the gloom. The stairs went down 3 levels, far deeper than any official blueprints indicated. The walls were slick with moisture and covered in strange markings, tally marks scratched into the concrete by the thousands, maybe tens of thousands. At the bottom, they found themselves in a corridor that stretched in both directions beyond the reach of their lights. The ceiling was low, barely 6 feet high, supported by rusted iron beams. Every 20 feet, there was a cell door, identical to the ones upstairs but older, cruder. Dr. Webb stopped at the first door, running his fingers over the iron. "This design predates Alcatraz as a federal prison," he whispered. "This is from when it was a military fortress, possibly even earlier. These cells shouldn't exist." Agent Morrison pulled open the first door. Inside was a skeleton, still wearing the remnants of a military uniform from the late 1800s. The skull had been crushed, as if something incredibly strong had squeezed it until it shattered. Scratched into the wall above the remains were words in an older form of English: "The water brings them at high tide." They moved deeper into the tunnel system. Every cell contained remains. Some were ancient, some relatively recent. One held a prisoner in a 1940s uniform, another from the 1950s. All showed signs of violent death. All had tried to write warnings on the walls. Morrison photographed everything, her mind racing to make sense of what she was seeing. This wasn't just a hidden level of the prison. This was a tomb, a mass grave that had been collecting bodies for over a century. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, roughly circular, about 50 feet in diameter. The floor was flooded with about 2 feet of dark water that reflected their flashlights like black glass. In the center of the chamber stood a massive iron pillar, running from floor to ceiling, covered in chains and locks. Bolted to the pillar were metal plates inscribed with names and dates. Morrison waded closer, the water ice-cold against her legs. The earliest date she could find was 1859. The most recent was June 11, 1962. 3 names: Frank Morris, John Anglin, Clarence Anglin. "They didn't make it off the island," Morrison said, her voice barely audible. "They made it down here." Dr. Webb was examining the walls of the chamber. They were covered in more carvings, but these were different. Detailed illustrations showing the island's layout, the water around it, and something else, figures rising from the bay. "This was a containment site," he said, his voice shaking. "Alcatraz wasn't built as a prison first. It was built as a barrier. The military fortress, the federal prison, it was all designed to keep people here, to feed whatever is in these waters." One of the structural engineers, a woman named Lisa Park, was using a depth finder on the water. "This chamber isn't flooded," she said. "This is a well. It goes down at least 200 feet, possibly connecting to underwater caves beneath the bay. And there's movement down there. Something large." The scraping sound they had heard earlier grew louder. It was coming from the water, from deep within the well. Morrison ordered everyone to back toward the tunnel entrance. That's when they noticed the water level was rising. It had been at their shins. Now it was at their knees. The tide was coming in. The surface of the water began to ripple. Then something broke through. A hand, grey and bloated, fingers webbed and elongated. Then another. Then dozens. They weren't swimming up. They were climbing, using chains attached to the pillar that descended into the depths. The bodies emerged slowly, prisoners from different eras, their faces distorted by decades of underwater pressure and something else, something that had changed them. Their eyes were white, pupilless. Their mouths were filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. Morrison pulled her weapon and fired. The bullets passed through the nearest figure like it was made of water. It didn't even slow down. The team ran. Behind them, the things that had once been men pulled themselves from the well, their movements jerky and wrong, like puppets on strings. The scraping sound was their chains dragging across the stone floor. They reached the stairs and climbed frantically. Behind them, the corridor filled with the sound of pursuit, wet footsteps and the rattling of chains. Morrison was the last one up. As she reached the top and helped seal the door, she looked back. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was Thomas Blackwell, or what was left of him. He stared up at her with those blank white eyes. In his hand was the sharpened spoon. He raised one finger to his lips. "Be quiet." Then he turned and walked back into the darkness, and the door slammed shut with a force that cracked the concrete around it. The team emerged into the cell block, gasping, shaking. They had been underground for 47 minutes. Above them, tourists walked through the prison, taking selfies, laughing, completely unaware. Morrison sealed the shower room and posted guards. She called her supervisor in Washington and explained what they had found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Seal it. All of it. This investigation is now classified." But that night, as Morrison sat in her hotel room in San Francisco, she received an email from an unknown address. Attached was a video file. Against her better judgment, she opened it. The video was security footage from inside Alcatraz, time-stamped 3 hours ago, long after the building had closed. The camera showed cell block D, empty and dark. Then, one by one, the cell doors began to open. And from each one, a figure emerged and stood at attention, facing the camera. Thomas Blackwell stood in front, his white eyes staring directly into the lens. His mouth moved, forming words she could lip-read clearly. "High tide is coming. And we are so very hungry." The video ended. Morrison tried to trace the email. It had been sent from inside Alcatraz, from a computer terminal in the ranger station. But no one had been on the island for hours. The building was locked down. Empty. Or so they thought. Morrison didn't sleep that night. She sat in her hotel room, staring at the frozen frame of Thomas Blackwell's face on her laptop screen, those hollow white eyes burning into her mind. At 3 in the morning, her phone rang. It was Officer Dennis Park, one of the National Park Service guards she had posted at the sealed entrance. His voice was panicked, barely coherent. "Agent Morrison, you need to get here now. The door, it's opening from the inside. We can hear them coming up the stairs." She arrived at Alcatraz 40 minutes later, taking the emergency Park Service boat across the black waters of the bay. The island loomed ahead like a tumor rising from the sea. Every light in the main prison building was blazing, even though the power had been shut off hours ago. As her boat approached the dock, she could see figures standing in the windows of cell block D, motionless silhouettes backlit by that impossible light. Officer Park met her at the dock. His face was chalk white, his hands trembling. "They're not attacking," he said. "They're just standing there. Waiting. And Morrison, there are dozens of them. Way more than we saw in the basement. Every cell in D block has one. They appeared exactly at high tide, 2 hours ago. We tried to evacuate, but the boats won't start. The radios are dead. Every electronic device on the island just stopped working." Morrison entered the cell house with her weapon drawn, though she knew bullets were useless. The air inside was frigid, her breath forming clouds despite it being June. She could hear water dripping everywhere, as if the entire building was weeping. The figures stood perfectly still in their cells, facing outward. As she walked past, their heads turned in unison to follow her movement. She recognized some of them from the historical records. Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud, the Birdman, Al Capone. Men who had died decades ago, now standing here, transformed into something else. She reached cell 14. Thomas Blackwell stood at the bars, waiting for her. Up close, she could see that his skin had a translucent quality, like he was partially made of water. Veins of bioluminescent blue ran beneath the surface, pulsing with the rhythm of the tide. When he spoke, his voice sounded like waves breaking on rocks. "You shouldn't have opened the door, Agent Morrison. We've been maintaining the balance for so long. Keeping them fed. Keeping them satisfied. But you broke the seal, and now they know the surface world still exists." "What are you?" Morrison asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We are the drowned guard," Blackwell said. "Every prison needs guards, even a prison built to contain something far worse than criminals. The Spanish discovered it first, when they fortified this island in the 1700s. There are caves beneath the bay, tunnels that lead to places deeper than any ocean. Things live there, ancient things that hunger for human souls. The native tribes knew. They called this island the Evil Island, and they never came here. Never. But white men thought they knew better." He pressed his face against the bars. "So they made a deal. Build a prison. Fill it with the worst humanity has to offer. And when those prisoners die, or when they need to disappear, feed them to what waits below. In exchange, the things in the deep stay down there. They don't rise. They don't hunt in the bay. They don't climb onto the mainland and devour everything. It's a simple transaction. Blood for safety." Morrison felt her stomach turn. The famous escapes. Blackwell, Morris, the Anglins, they weren't really escapes, were they? "Some tried," Blackwell said, something like sadness flickering across his inhuman face. "Morris and the Anglins made it to the water. They thought they were free. But the things below were waiting. We tried to warn them. I tried. But they wouldn't listen. And when you volunteer to enter the water at night, during high tide, well, that's not escape. That's sacrifice. The best kind, because they chose it. Willing souls taste sweeter, apparently." "And you?" Morrison asked. "Why did you stay?" "Because someone had to maintain the feeding schedule. After Alcatraz closed as a federal prison, the government thought they could just walk away. Seal it up. Turn it into a tourist attraction. They didn't understand. The things below don't care about politics or bureaucracy. They were promised food, and they expect delivery. So I stayed. I became the warden of a prison with only one prisoner, myself. I've been rationing my own humanity for 56 years, feeding pieces of my soul down into the dark to keep them satisfied."
The building shuddered. The lights flickered. From deep below, Morrison heard something immense moving through water. "But I'm almost gone now," Blackwell continued. "There's almost nothing left of Thomas Edwin Blackwell. And when I'm gone completely, when there's no one left to feed them, they will rise. They will leave these waters. And they will feed on every city within 1,000 miles." Morrison's mind raced through options, protocols, procedures. None of them applied here. This was beyond the FBI, beyond any government agency. "What if we started again?" she heard herself say. "What if we found a way to continue the arrangement?" Blackwell's eyes, those terrible white eyes, seemed to focus on her for the first time with something like recognition. "You would volunteer. You would take the warden's position, knowing what it means. Knowing you would have to lure people here, make them disappear, feed them to monsters just to protect a world that will never know what you sacrificed. If it's the only way," Morrison said, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "It's not," said a voice behind her. Dr. Marcus Webb stepped out of the shadows, holding Blackwell's journal. "I've been reading his entries. All of them. There's another way. The things below, they don't just hunger for human souls. They hunger for guilt, for the weight of unpunished crimes. That's why it had to be prisoners. That's why it had to be the worst of humanity. Their guilt is what sustains the creatures, more than their flesh or their souls. Webb turned to Blackwell. But you've been feeding them your own guilt for decades. The guilt of being a murderer. The guilt of every person you failed to save. The guilt of maintaining this horrible system. You've been poisoning them slowly with remorse. That's why they're weaker now. That's why they haven't risen yet despite the broken seal. Blackwell staggered back from the bars. I didn't know. I thought I was barely keeping them satisfied. You were killing them, Webb said. Guilt is poison to creatures of pure hunger. And if we can flood these tunnels with enough remorse, enough genuine human regret, we can end them forever. Morrison understood. The confession program. The victim impact statements. We bring people here, people carrying genuine guilt, people who want to unburden themselves. We turn Alcatraz into a place of atonement instead of punishment. The waters below will drink in that remorse until there's nothing left of the creatures but empty husks. The building shattered again, more violently this time. Cracks appeared in the walls. The figures in the cells began to move, to scream, a sound like drowning multiplied by 100. Blackwell looked at Morrison, and for a moment, his eyes were brown again, human again. Do it, he said. But you need to start now. You need the first confession before dawn, before the next high tide. Otherwise, they'll be strong enough to break free. Morrison pulled out her phone. By some miracle, it had a signal again. She called her supervisor in Washington. I need a helicopter. I need a priest, a rabbi, a therapist, anyone who handles confessions. And I need them on Alcatraz in the next hour. I can't explain. You just have to trust me. They came. A Catholic priest from San Francisco, still in his pajamas. A psychologist who specialized in criminal rehabilitation. Even a chaplain from San Quentin who happened to be awake. Morrison brought them to cell block D and explained nothing except that they needed to listen. To hear confessions. To accept guilt. The priest stood in front of cell 14, where Blackwell waited. Father, Blackwell whispered, forgive me, for I have sinned. It has been 56 years since my last confession. As he spoke, as he unburdened every terrible thing he had done and allowed to be done, the water in the basement began to churn. The creatures below thrashed and writhed, drowning in an ocean of remorse. One by one, the figures in the cells began to fade, released from their eternal guard duty. The impossible light dimmed. The building stopped shaking. By dawn, it was over. The basement was dry. The well was just a well, empty and cold and dead. Thomas Blackwell's body was found in cell 14, truly dead this time, a peaceful expression on his face. The other remains were catalogued and, eventually, given proper burials. Morrison stood on the dock as the sun rose over San Francisco. Dr. Webb stood beside her. We should tell someone, she said. The truth. What really happened here? Who would believe us? Webb replied. And even if they did, what good would it do? The threat is over. The creatures are gone. Let Alcatraz be what it's become. A tourist attraction, a monument to crime and punishment. Some prisons are meant to be haunted. Some stories are meant to end in the dark. Morrison nodded slowly. She would file her report. It would be classified, buried, forgotten. The official story would say they found evidence of a hidden sublevel used for storing supplies. The body in cell 14 was a homeless man who had somehow snuck onto the island. Case closed, but 3 months later, Morrison received another email from that same unknown address. This time, there was no video, just a single sentence and a photograph. The sentence read, "Thank you for freeing us. But remember, every prison has more than one level." The photograph was taken from underwater, looking up at the bottom of Alcatraz. In the murky depths, something huge was moving. Something that made the creatures in the well look like minnows. And carved into the bedrock beneath the island in letters 50 feet tall were words that predated human language. The first level is always the shallowest. Morrison deleted the email. She requested a transfer to a landlocked state. She never went near the ocean again. But sometimes, on nights when the tide was high, she would wake up hearing that scraping sound. Chains dragging across stone. Getting closer. Always closer. Because some prisons never truly close. They just wait for the right warden to open the next door. And in San Francisco Bay, on foggy mornings when the tourists haven't yet arrived, visitors to Alcatraz sometimes report seeing figures standing in the windows of cell block D, not threatening, not attacking, just watching, waiting, counting down to the next high tide. If you ever visit the island and you hear water dripping where no water should be, walk away. Don't investigate. Don't ask questions. Because the ghosts of Alcatraz aren't haunting the prison. They're guarding it. And what they're guarding against is so much worse than any ghost could ever be.